The local VA coffee shop was nearly empty that morning, just a few veterans scattered among the tables, each lost in their own thoughts. I wouldn't have noticed Thomas Miller if he hadn't been absently stirring his coffee for the past 20 minutes, the small clink of his spoon against the cup creating a rhythm that seemed to echo his distant memories. At 73, Thomas still carried himself like the Marine he once was, but there was something different about him today. His usual military precision had given way to a kind of restless energy. He'd finally decided to talk about that day in 1968, a day he'd kept buried in the deepest corners of his mind for over 5 decades. You know, he began, his voice barely above a whisper, some memories don't fade with time. They just wait, like landmines in your mind, ready to bring everything back in perfect clarity. He placed his spoon down carefully, as if the small sound might shatter the fragile moment. Thomas had been a 20-year-old kid from Ohio when he arrived in Vietnam, fresh-faced and full of the kind of confidence that only youth can provide. We all thought we knew what we were getting into. We'd seen the news reels, heard the stories. But nothing could have prepared us for the reality of that place. His fingers traced the rim of his coffee cup, a habit he'd developed to ground himself when the memories became too vivid. I was assigned to the 3rd Marine Division, operating near the DMZ. By June 1968, I'd been in country for 4 months. Long enough to lose my initial fear, but not long enough to develop the kind of instincts that kept you alive. The morning that would change his life forever started like any other in the Vietnamese jungle. His unit had been conducting sweep and clear operations, moving through the dense vegetation with the weight of their equipment and the oppressive heat making every step a challenge. The jungle, it was alive in a way that's hard to explain to someone who wasn't there. Every shadow could hide an enemy, every rustle of leaves could be your last warning. You learned to live with a kind of tension that never really went away. Your body was always ready, always waiting for something to happen. Thomas paused, taking a slow sip of his now cold coffee. We'd been moving since dawn, following intelligence about enemy movements in the area. The monsoon season had just started, and the rain made everything worse, the mud, the visibility, the way sound played tricks on your mind. His unit had 12 men, a typical squad size for these operations. They'd been working together for months, developing the kind of wordless communication that comes from sharing danger day after day. Joey Martinez was on point that morning. Good kid from New Mexico, had a way of finding paths through the densest jungle. Behind him was Doc Peterson, our medic. Then me, then the others, spread out in a formation we'd practiced countless times. The events that followed would haunt Thomas for the rest of his life. It was almost midday when everything changed. The rain had finally let up, and the jungle was doing that thing where it seems to steam, like everything was cooking in the heat. Martinez had just signaled for us to hold position, he'd spotted something ahead. Thomas's hands were steady now, but his eyes had taken on a distant look, seeing not the VA coffee shop but the dense Vietnamese jungle of his youth. What happened next, it wasn't like the movies. There was no dramatic build-up, no tense music warning us that our lives were about to change forever. Just a moment of absolute normalcy, and then he fell silent for a moment, gathering his thoughts. You know what I remember most clearly? The sound of birds. There were these little birds, don't know what kind, making this chirping noise above us. Then they suddenly went quiet. In the jungle, silence was always the first warning. Martinez had frozen in place, his hand raised in the signal to stop. Through the dense foliage, they could see movement ahead, the subtle shift of shadows that might be enemy soldiers, might be the wind, might be their imaginations playing tricks on them again. We'd been in firefights before. Had close calls, lost friends. But this was different. There was something about the stillness, the way the air felt heavy with more than just humidity. Martinez took one step forward, just one, to get a better look at what was ahead. Thomas's voice grew quieter, forcing listeners to lean in. That's when we heard it. A click. Just a small sound, really. But in that moment it was louder than any explosion. Martinez heard it too. He didn't move, didn't breathe. We all knew what that sound meant. The next few seconds stretched into an eternity. Martinez stood perfectly still, his boot resting on what they all knew must be a pressure-activated mine. One wrong move, one shift in weight, and their point man would be gone. Time does strange things in moments like that. Everything slows down, becomes crystal clear. I could see a bead of sweat rolling down Martinez's neck, could hear each breath from the men around me. Doc Peterson was already moving forward, slow and careful, but I knew what I had to do. Thomas had been trained in explosives, had taken extra courses before deployment. He wasn't an expert, but he knew more than most about the kinds of devices they encountered in the field. I moved before I could think too much about it. That was probably what saved us both, acting on instinct rather than letting fear take over. The next few minutes would test everything Thomas had learned, everything he believed about himself, and everything he understood about courage and fear. I reached Martinez, put my hand on his shoulder. I can still feel how he was trembling, trying so hard to stay still. He was just a kid, we all were, but in that moment, he showed more courage than I've seen in all the years since. Thomas adjusted his position in his chair, the memory clearly weighing on him. What happened next, that's what I've never talked about. Not to the psychiatrists at the VA, not to my wife, not to anyone. But maybe it's time. Maybe someone needs to hear this story, needs to understand what that day taught me about humanity, about courage, about the moments that define us. He looked up, his eyes clear and focused now. Because what happened next wasn't just about survival. It wasn't just about military training or protocol. It was about something deeper, something that would change how I saw everything, war, peace, life itself. And maybe, just maybe, that's why I'm finally ready to tell this story. Thomas took a long breath before continuing, his hands now steady on the coffee cup. The morning crowd at the VA coffee shop had thinned out, leaving an atmosphere of quiet anticipation. When you're facing a situation like that, time becomes meaningless. Every second feels like an hour, but somehow hours can pass in what feels like seconds. I knew that any movement, any mistake, could end not just Martinez's life, but potentially several others in the squad. The jungle heat had been oppressive that day, making every movement more dangerous as sweat dripped into their eyes. I slowly knelt beside Martinez, trying to keep my own breathing steady. I could hear Doc Peterson behind me, ready to move if things went wrong. The rest of the squad had created a perimeter, watching for any enemy movement. We were exposed, vulnerable. Thomas remembered every detail with crystal clarity. I started clearing away the vegetation around Martinez's boot, millimeter by millimeter. Each movement had to be precise, you never knew if there were secondary triggers. The device was buried shallow, typical of the Viet Cong's hasty mining operations. But something about it seemed different. As he worked, Thomas noticed unusual details about the mine's placement. Most pressure mines we encountered were laid in obvious patrol routes or near valuable targets. This one was in an apparently random location, and its positioning was strange. It wasn't set quite like the others we'd seen. The tension in the squad was palpable. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call could signal an ambush. Martinez was holding up incredibly well, but I could see the strain in his face. He'd been standing perfectly still for almost 20 minutes now, muscles cramping, knowing that one wrong move could end everything. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The mine wasn't just different, it was something entirely new. The firing mechanism had modifications I'd never seen before. This wasn't a standard Viet Cong device. This was something else. Thomas paused, taking a sip of his coffee. In that moment, I had to make a decision. Standard procedure would have been to try to disarm it following our training protocols. But something in my gut told me this was different. This device wasn't meant just to kill, it was meant to teach us something. What happened next would challenge everything Thomas thought he knew about the war. I asked Martinez to describe exactly what he'd felt when he stepped on the mine. His description confirmed my suspicions. The click we'd heard, it wasn't quite right for a pressure plate activation. I made a decision that, by all military protocols, was completely wrong. I told Martinez to lift his foot. Every bit of training we'd had said this would trigger the explosion. The rest of the squad tensed, expecting the worst. But I knew, something wasn't right. Martinez, trusting his fellow Marine, slowly lifted his foot. There was no explosion. Instead, they found something that would haunt Thomas for decades to come. Under that mine was a note, written in perfect English. It read, "American soldiers, you are fighting a war you don't understand. Today, you were spared. Remember this moment." It was signed by someone calling themselves the teacher. The discovery sent shockwaves through the squad. The mine was a dummy, expertly crafted to look and feel real, even down to the click of the pressure plate. But its purpose wasn't to kill, it was to deliver a message. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to create this moment. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just psychological warfare. This was something more personal, more targeted. Someone on the other side wasn't just fighting us, they were trying to communicate with us, to make us think about what we were doing there. Thomas and his squad secured the area and called an EOD, explosive ordnance disposal, to properly examine the device. The EOD guys were as baffled as we were. The craftsmanship of the dummy mine was exceptional. Whoever built it had intimate knowledge of both American and Vietnamese explosive devices. The incident changed something in Thomas and his squad. We'd been trained to see the enemy as just that, the enemy. But this humanized them in a way none of us were prepared for. Someone had chosen to make a point without taking a life. In a war where death was the currency of daily existence, this act of mercy was more shocking than any firefight. The following days were filled with debriefings and investigations. Intelligence wanted to know everything about the teacher. Had we encountered similar devices? Had other units received messages? But this seemed to be an isolated incident. Or at least, if there were others, no one was talking about them. Thomas struggled with the meaning of the message. We were all young, most of us barely out of high school. We thought we understood what we were fighting for: democracy, freedom, stopping the spread of communism. But that note, it made us question everything. The impact on Martinez was particularly profound. He'd been given his life back by someone who was supposed to be his enemy. That changes a person. He wasn't the same after that day. None of us were. The squad's dynamic shifted subtly but significantly. We became more cautious, more thoughtful. Every engagement, every decision was colored by the knowledge that our enemy was capable of this kind of complex humanity. It made the war harder in some ways, easier in others. Thomas leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. But the real shock came 3 weeks later. We were running another patrol, different area, different mission. We'd almost managed to put the incident behind us. Almost. They had been moving through a particularly dense section of jungle when they found it, another dummy mine, another note. This one was different. It read, "Your compassion in sparing the village last week was noted. Humanity exists on both sides of this conflict." We hadn't spared any village. We hadn't even been near a village in weeks. The realization hit them hard. Someone was watching us, studying us, testing us. Not just as soldiers, but as human beings. The teacher wasn't just sending messages, they were conducting an experiment in humanity. The psychological impact was immense. Every step, every decision, every interaction with locals, we started wondering if we were being watched, being tested. It was like being part of some grand moral experiment that we hadn't signed up for. Thomas's unit began finding similar devices and messages in various locations. Each one was different, but they all shared the same theme, making us think about the human cost of war, about the choices we were making, about the thin line between enemy and friend. We started calling them teachers' tests. Some were simple dummy minds with messages. Others were more elaborate, complex scenarios that forced us to make moral choices. We never knew which were part of the experiment and which were real combat situations. The experience changed their approach to warfare. We became more hesitant to engage, more likely to try to find peaceful solutions. Some might say it made us less effective soldiers, but I think it made us better human beings. Thomas stopped, looking down at his hands. You know what the strangest part was? We never reported most of these incidents. Neither did other units who encountered similar tests. It was like we all collectively decided that some truths were too complicated for the official record. The teacher's identity remained a mystery. Some thought it was a Vietnamese intellectual, others suggested a disillusioned American advisor. There were even theories about it being a joint effort between people on both sides who wanted to end the war. The psychological warfare aspect was unprecedented. This wasn't about breaking our will to fight. It was about making us think about why we were fighting. Every message, every test, forced us to confront the humanity of our enemy and question our own actions. Thomas shifted in his chair, the morning sun now streaming through the VA coffee shop windows. His coffee had gone cold, but he hardly noticed, lost in the weight of his memories. The thing about psychological warfare is that once it takes root, it changes everything. After our encounters with the teacher's messages, every patrol became a test of our humanity. We started seeing meaning in things we would have ignored before. The impact spread beyond their immediate squad. Through whispered conversations and shared experiences, they learned that other units had encountered similar situations. It was like a secret society of the haunted. We'd meet other soldiers who had that same look in their eyes, that knowledge that this war wasn't as simple as we'd been told. Thomas remembered a particularly powerful incident that occurred about 2 months after their first encounter. We were sweeping through a small hamlet, standard search and clear operation. Found a cache of weapons in one of the huts. Standard procedure was to detain everyone, burn the structures. But there was something about the way the weapons were stored. The cache had been arranged in an unusual pattern, almost like a display. Among the rifles and ammunition, we found another note: these weapons belong to men who died last month. Their families know nothing of war. What would your mothers do in their place? The message hit home hard. We stood there, looking at those weapons, thinking about our own mothers back home. Thinking about what they would do if they were living in a war zone, trying to protect their families. It humanized the enemy in a way that was almost unbearable. Their commanding officer, Captain Reynolds, made an unprecedented decision that day. Instead of burning the hamlet, we confiscated the weapons but left everything else untouched. We even helped an old woman repair her roof before we left. The locals looked at us like we were crazy. Maybe we were. The psychological impact of these encounters began to manifest in various ways. Some guys couldn't handle it. The uncertainty, the constant moral questioning, it was too much. They requested transfers, claimed equipment malfunctions, anything to get reassigned. Others became almost obsessed with finding more messages, more tests. Thomas's voice grew thoughtful. The teacher's methods were ingenious in their simplicity. They weren't just trying to stop us from fighting, they were making us think about why we were fighting. Every message was like a small crack in the wall of our certainty. The effects rippled through their daily operations. We started approaching villages differently. Instead of seeing potential enemy positions, we saw homes. Instead of suspicious civilians, we saw families caught in the middle of something they never asked for. It made our job harder, but it also made it more human. One particular message stood out in Thomas's memory. We found it after a fierce firefight. Several of our men were wounded, 2 killed. The note was placed where we would find it during casualty evacuation: today, mothers on both sides weep. The earth drinks the same blood. The impact on morale was complex. It didn't make us less effective soldiers. In some ways, we became better. More cautious, more strategic, more aware of the consequences of our actions. But it also made everything harder. Every decision carried the weight of its moral implications. Thomas paused, collecting his thoughts. The teacher's campaign wasn't just about the messages. It was about creating witnesses. We became carriers of a different narrative about the war, about the enemy, about ourselves. It was psychological warfare aimed not at breaking us, but at transforming us. The transformation manifested in unexpected ways. We started leaving our own messages. Small things at first, a packet of cigarettes with a family photo, a shared meal left untouched, a damaged religious item carefully repaired. It was like we were answering the teacher's call for humanity. Their unit developed new unofficial protocols. Before entering a village, we'd look for signs, arrangements of stones, markings on trees, anything that might be a message. We became students of a different kind of warfare, one fought with symbols and gestures rather than bullets. The experience changed how they handled civilians. We started seeing them as potential teachers, potential students. Every interaction became an opportunity for understanding. Some guys learned Vietnamese, not just the basic phrases, but really learned it. They wanted to hear the stories, understand the perspectives. Thomas remembered one particularly moving encounter. We found an injured Vietnamese woman, probably caught in crossfire. Standard procedure was to call it in and move on. But next to her was a note: "She is a teacher of children. What would your children learn from your choice today?" They spent 6 hours getting her to medical care, risking their own safety in the process. She survived. Months later, we passed through her village again. The children ran out to greet us, not with fear, but with drawings they had made. Their teacher had taught them about the Americans who chose compassion over protocol. The psychological impact went deeper than anyone could have anticipated. We started questioning everything. Not just our orders, but our entire understanding of the war. Every firefight became a moral decision. Every civilian encounter became a test of our humanity. Some officers noticed the change in their men. They couldn't quite put their finger on what was different, but they knew something had shifted. We were following orders, completing missions, but there was a hesitation, a thoughtfulness that hadn't been there before. The teacher's influence spread in subtle ways. Other units started reporting similar experiences. Different messages, different tests, but the same underlying theme, forcing us to see the humanity in our enemy and the complexity of our situation. Thomas leaned back, his expression distant. You know what the hardest part was? Knowing that somewhere out there, someone was watching us, evaluating not just our military actions, but our moral choices. Every decision we made could be part of the test. The psychological weight became almost unbearable at times. We started seeing messages even where there weren't any. Every civilian gesture, every enemy action, became loaded with potential meaning. We were like literature students, analyzing every detail for hidden significance. Their combat effectiveness actually improved in some ways. We became more careful, more precise. Fewer civilian casualties, better intelligence gathering. When you start seeing the enemy as human, you start fighting smarter, not just harder. But the cost was high. The certainty that gets you through a war, the clear division between good guys and bad guys, that was gone. We were operating in a moral gray zone where every action had to be weighed against its human impact. Thomas stopped, taking a moment to gather his thoughts. The teacher's campaign changed us in ways that went beyond the war. It affected how we saw everything: politics, conflict, human nature itself. We became carriers of a different kind of truth about war. The impact lasted long after their tours ended. Many of us stayed in touch, bound by this shared experience that we could never fully explain to others. We called ourselves the teacher's students, though we never knew if we had passed or failed the tests we were given. Thomas's voice grew stronger as he continued. But the real test wasn't about passing or failing. It was about learning to see, really see, the humanity in everyone, even those we were supposed to call enemy. That lesson changed everything. The afternoon light had begun to fade in the VA coffee shop, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Thomas's face seemed to hold both the weight of his memories and a quiet resolution, as if sharing his story had finally lifted a burden he'd carried for decades. Coming home after those experiences, it was different from what most veterans faced. Sure, we all struggled with the usual things, the nightmares, the adjustment, the feeling that civilians couldn't understand. But for those of us who had encountered the teacher, there was something more. Thomas pulled out a small, weathered notebook from his jacket pocket. I started keeping track of the others who had similar experiences. Over the years, I've connected with 43 veterans who encountered the teacher's messages. Each story is different, but they all share the same thread of transformation. The impact on their post-war lives took various forms. Some of us became teachers ourselves. Others went into conflict resolution or international relations. Martinez, the one who stepped on that first dummy mine, he became a peace activist. But all of us were changed in ways that went beyond typical war experiences. Thomas opened his notebook, revealing pages of careful notes and observations. For years, I've been trying to understand the full scope of what the teacher accomplished. It wasn't just about changing how we fought the war. It was about changing how we would live with the memory of it. The veterans who had encountered the teacher's messages shared a unique perspective on the war. We couldn't simply file it away as us versus them. We carried these complicated truths about humanity, about the artificial nature of enemy lines, about the possibility of compassion even in the darkest moments. Some of them tried to find the teacher after the war. In the 1990s, when relations with Vietnam began to normalize, a group of us went back. We visited our old patrol areas, talked to locals, tried to piece together the mystery. We never found concrete answers, but what we discovered was remarkable. Thomas leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. We found that similar messages had been left for Vietnamese soldiers. Some of their veterans told us about encountering tests of their own, moral challenges that made them question their assumptions about American soldiers. The revelation was stunning. The teacher hadn't just been working on American forces. They had been conducting a massive experiment in human consciousness, trying to create bridges of understanding across enemy lines. It was psychological warfare aimed at peace, not victory. The impact extended far beyond individual soldiers. Over the years, we've traced how these experiences influenced military policy, international relations, even peace negotiations. The ripples of the teacher's work touched more lives than we'll ever know. Thomas shared some of the long-term effects on his fellow veterans. John Peterson, our medic, became a doctor working in war zones. He says the teacher showed him that healing isn't just about bodies, it's about minds and hearts too. Mike Collins started a program bringing together veterans from both sides of conflicts. Sarah Martinez, Joey's daughter, teaches conflict resolution in high schools. The psychological transformation was profound and lasting. We learned to live with ambiguity, to see beyond simple answers. When you've experienced something that challenges everything you were taught about war and enemies, you can't go back to black and white thinking. Thomas described how these experiences affected their relationships with other veterans. It could be isolating. How do you explain to someone who hasn't experienced it that the most profound moment of your war wasn't a battle, but a message from an unknown enemy that saved your humanity? The impact on their families was complex. Our children grew up hearing different kinds of war stories. Not just about combat and courage, but about moments of choice, about seeing the humanity in the enemy, about the complexity of right and wrong in war. Some of the veterans struggled with their experiences in unique ways. It's one thing to deal with trauma from violence, there are protocols, therapies, support systems for that. But how do you process trauma from an act of mercy that shattered your worldview? The VA didn't have a category for that. Thomas had spent years studying psychological warfare and its effects. What the teacher did was unprecedented. Most psychological warfare aims to demoralize, to break the enemy's will to fight. This was different. It was designed to elevate, to awaken consciousness, to build bridges across the divide of war. The long-term impact on military strategy was subtle but significant. Some of us who stayed in the military tried to incorporate these lessons into training. How do you teach soldiers to be effective warriors while maintaining their humanity? How do you prepare them for moral complexity in combat? Thomas shared how these experiences influenced his own life's path. I became a teacher myself, though not in the conventional sense. I work with veterans struggling with moral injury, helping them find ways to reconcile their experiences with their humanity. The teacher showed us that the greatest battles are fought within ourselves. The ripple effects continued through generations. My grandson is in the military now. When he deployed to Afghanistan, I shared some of the teacher's messages with him. Not the specific words, but the underlying wisdom about seeing humanity in the enemy, about the moral complexity of war. Thomas pulled out another photograph, this one showing a group of aging veterans, American and Vietnamese, standing together at a reconciliation event. This was taken last year. See the man on the left? He encountered one of the teacher's messages on the other side. We found we had more in common than we ever imagined. The search for the teacher's identity continued over the years. We've had theories, a Buddhist monk, a disillusioned intelligence officer, a network of peace activists. But maybe not knowing is part of the message. The teacher could have been anyone who understood that war destroys humanity on both sides. Thomas spoke about the broader implications for future conflicts. In an age of increasingly technological warfare, the teacher's lessons are more relevant than ever. How do we maintain our humanity when warfare becomes more distant, more automated? How do we remember the human cost on all sides? The veterans who encountered the teacher's messages had developed their own philosophy over the years. We came to understand that true strength isn't about the ability to destroy, but the courage to see humanity in your enemy. That's a harder skill to master than any weapon. Thomas closed his notebook, his expression thoughtful. You know what I consider the teacher's greatest achievement? It wasn't just changing how we fought the war. It was changing how we lived with the peace. We became carriers of a different kind of wisdom about conflict and humanity. As our conversation drew to a close, Thomas shared one final reflection. People often ask me if I ever resented the teacher for making the war more complicated, for taking away the simple certainty that helps soldiers survive. But that's missing the point. The teacher didn't make the war more complicated, they helped us see the complexity that was always there. He stood slowly, preparing to leave. In the end, the teacher's greatest lesson wasn't about war at all. It was about choice. Every moment, even in war, we have choices about how to maintain our humanity. That's not just a lesson for soldiers, it's a lesson for everyone. Thomas turned to leave, then paused. You know what I wonder sometimes? How many teachers are out there right now, in current conflicts, leaving their own messages, their own tests of humanity? Maybe that's the real legacy, not just the messages we found, but the inspiration for others to carry on this work of awakening consciousness in the midst of war.